Good afternoon, my little shit weasels. How we doing?
Okay, so this is something that I'm still in the middle of explaining slash depicting slash aggregating. So take all of this with a grain of salt. This is a new approach to how short interest is interpreted and potentially yields a explanation for rehypothecation. Rehypothecation, put simply, has to do with the markets of debt, in which case, if you have a loan of something that has defaulted or has lost its ability to be paid for, its interest paid for, you can actually sell this still existing loan that has gone dormant or delinquent to someone else who wants to take on that debt. And then the person who takes on that debt will find a new counterparty to facilitate that loan and its payments. This happens all over the economy. This happens with car loans, mortgages, phone plan payments, you name it. There is a huge market for debt, and it's just as important as the debit side of markets. The reason why this is important is because this also takes place within the securities lending market, which is the centerfold for where short selling takes place. Those who have exuberant amounts of shares who want to earn a passive income, known as a yield, can pony up their own securities to be borrowed, and then that party will then create interest payments to the person with exuberant amounts of securities. You typically find this with entities that are responsible within the fixed income markets, so mutual funds, pension funds, money market funds, etc., etc. The entities that create those funds are your common names like BlackRock and Vanguard and so on and so forth. This is why entities like BlackRock and Vanguard manage teachers' funds, firefighter funds, state funds. They're literally creating passive income that they can then allocate between different funds. This is why you'll see entities like BlackRock purchase a bunch of shares of AMC or GameStop or Mullen, which is something we're going to be covering because that's a very interesting situation. But back to the point, these entities, these parties are responsible for the majority of the equities market in terms of fixed income. With that being said, I have a proposition that, again, is still being worked on, so take it with a grain of salt, that has to do with toxic equity security loans. A toxic asset is something that you find on someone's balance sheet. The term toxic is very arbitrary. It typically just means that the person who has it on their balance sheet does not want to hold it on there because it is somehow negatively affecting the rest of the portfolio. In which case, you will typically remove that from your balance sheet by taking a cut somewhere in typical process of getting it off. In English, this can simply mean you need to sell something and you're willing to sell it at a loss or at a less of a profit because you're exchanging the premium that you get in return of the expediency of that removal. So let's all bring this together. I believe that so far, this is what the data is showing me, take it with a grain of salt. I have a bunch of stocks and ETFs that I'm working on. So far, I have GameStop, AMC, Mullen, and XRT, where I depict some of these statistics. This data is coming from Ortex. If you don't like Ortex, go fuck yourself. Essentially, what I'm covering here is if you look at this aggregate statistic that I've come up with, known as loan density, which is simply the total amount of shares on loan divided by the number of loans. This data is coming from Ortex. You can derive an average number of shares per loan. Typically, what you will see happen is, as the loan density increases, the cost to borrow will go down. How does this relate to what I've just said? Well, if the cost to borrow is going down and you have a high loan density, that suggests to me that the loans that are in circulation do not have the quality of credit that a loan with lesser density would have. In which case, whoever the lender or lendee is of these loans would want to get them off their books for some reason. If the loan density is egregiously high and the cost to borrow goes down, that suggests that the quality of these loans is not up to par. If you go to Ortex, you will often see that cost to borrow on some of these big names that retail have been following actually goes negative. Let me clean some of this up real quick. And we're going to go to cost to borrow, and then so right here on GameStop, we have the cost to borrow showing up as negative on March 8th with a negative 0.29% rate. So that literally means that whoever is borrowing these shares is being paid to borrow them, right? And the term borrow is also very arbitrary because it doesn't quite capture what the intent is of taking on a loan of shares. Okay, so you can see this happen fairly frequently throughout the history of GameStop and AMC, and I'm sure Mullen's going to follow suit. But just about every day or every 2 days, you're going to see a negative cost to borrow on equity loans. And typically around this time, you will also see that the density of each share loan is exuberantly high. Now, there's some caveats to this because there are a lot of variables at play here. It doesn't quite suggest that rehypothecation is going on, but it does suggest that there is something very snafu-y with the way that the securities lending market is treating these loans. Now, where does rehypothecation come in? Well, we're going to take a little trip down memory lane to 2008. The reason why the housing market crash of 2008 not only happened, but why it was so much of a contagion is because there was a group of really fucked up people who decided, we have all these loans that we've given out as banks and big money, and we can't get them off our books, or they aren't liquid enough, or we know that these aren't going to be paid for because they're variable interest rate, and we've signed people up for something we know that they can't pay for when they hit maturity. So what we're going to do is we're going to take all these poorly rated in credit mortgages. We're going to package them up. We're going to take 50% of these. We're going to create a new package. 50% of this package will be shit, as in low credit rating. We know that there is a very low chance that these will be paid for in full. And then we'll sprinkle in some AAAs, some highly rated mortgage loans. This is known as a mortgage-backed security. There was an instrument where you basically had a group of MBSs, mortgage-backed securities, put into one giant package. Half of it would be shit. The other half would be a little bit better than shit. And they would weight these accordingly so that they could give it an aggregate credit rating. This is how the contagion of 2008 began. This instrument was created somewhere in the 1970s or 80s, I believe. If you watch The Big Short, you can get a nice little history lesson on that. The reason why this was such a catastrophe is because this was an instance of rehypothecation. The term rehypothecation literally means if we were to rehypothecate, if we were to reassess this debt, hypothetically, what would it be worth? That's literally the linguistic structure of rehypothecation. If we restructure this debt, what would it hypothetically be worth? And then we're going to bring that hypothetical value to the market. This was a problem because as time went on, they kept redoing this, package within package. And before you knew it, you either ran out of highly rated MBSs, or those who were actually doing the packaging were intentionally skewing the rating and selling these MBS composites for more than what they were actually worth. And when the defaulting started, you literally had an explosion from within, like a nuclear bomb, in terms of how the housing market reacted. Because as each of these really shitty MBSs defaulted, it would cascade and cascade and cascade. And that's when you had figures like Michael Burry and so on and so forth. Watch The Big Short. You already know it. were able to recognize this from a distance is because they knew that this was a systemic error, that this would cascade and ripple throughout all of the other tranches within the MBS market. Okay. What does that mean for equities? I think the same thing is happening. If you look at loan density throughout history here on things like GameStop and AMC and the ETFs that aren't blue chips, you will see that the loan density, the average shares per loan, will skyrocket, and then the cost to borrow will go down. So we're going to pull up XRT real quick. I was just talking with True Demon about this. Shout out to him. Here is your standard deviation of cost to borrow in blue and your loan density in red, okay? For some reason, Google Sheets isn't showing the x-axis, so you don't see dates at all. But I went back and checked just for this. This is about November of 2019 right here, going into about June of 2020, I believe. So right before COVID and then 6 months after, give or take. The loan density skyrocketed, right? And then you see that the cost to borrow just shit the bed. And then we have another instance right here. Loan density skyrocketed. Cost to borrow shit the bed. Loan density skyrocketed. Cost to borrow skyrocketed. And then loan density went down, right? Now, again, there are a lot of statistics you have to factor in here. Things like the total short interest, the total number of loans. This picture can be interpreted ambiguously. But regardless of that, there is a case here that rehypothecation produces toxic assets, and you can see this occurring within the securities lending market. The fucked up part is that we don't have much data on the securities lending market, and for obvious reasons. There have been recent proposals and legislation brought by the SEC to include more in-depth information and reporting on securities lending. Whenever that gets to us, I'm going to be the first one on it. I'm also going to continue to develop this little thesis. This is fucked up. This is fucked up. Here's AMC, for example. The loan density skyrocketed. The loan density is in blue this time. The loan density skyrocketed, and then the cost to borrow standard deviation fell through the floor. We'll do GameStop real quick. Cost to borrow is in blue. Loan density is in red. You had a cost to borrow spike here, and then loan density fell off a cliff. And this goes all the way back to 2017. Sorry, I keep forgetting that there's no x-axis. And then ever since the loan density had been up, the cost to borrow ceased to really do anything. As of recent, we're starting to see some little specks of life as far as cost to borrow goes, but who knows? Here's another little interesting one. This is the securities lending market volume versus loan density. And this, as I dig into this more, will begin to make everything in terms of data more tangible. I think we're going to be getting a really interesting picture as this evolves. So I'm going to leave it at that. I will be providing tons of update videos. This also does factor in with the cycle and fractal theory, because the scaling amount of cost to borrow would also at some point interact with the cost of the stock, in which case, if you can find cyclic behavior within the cost to borrow and within loan density, you would also see that translate to price. So things are starting to come full picture, I think.